The man who would march across Europe under French imperial glory was born into a world that viewed France as a brutal, occupying force. In 1768, the Republic of Genoa ceded the island of Corsica to the French crown. When the local population resisted, the French military arrived in force, suppressing the independence movement through bloody skirmishes. Napoleon Bonaparte was born in 1769, just 3 months after the final Corsican defeat at Ponte Novo. This map illustrates the isolation of the island. Corsica is a rugged, mountainous territory, suddenly annexed and swallowed by the administrative machinery of the massive French Empire. Napoleon's father, Carlo, had originally supported the Corsican resistance. However, after the defeat, he chose to submit to the new regime. He traded his rebel uniform for the powdered wigs and silk waistcoats of the French court, successfully petitioning for noble status to ensure his family's financial survival. Young Napoleon watched as his father assimilated into the culture of the conquerors. It created an early, sharp friction in the household, a child who identified with a lost rebellion living under a father who served the French king. In 1779, at age 9, Napoleon was sent to mainland France for his education. He arrived at a religious school in Autun before moving to the military academy at Brienne, a stranger whose language he barely spoke. At Brienne, he was an outsider. His aristocratic French peers mocked his thick Corsican accent, his short stature, and his status as a conquered foreigner. The pressure on the young cadet intensified in 1785, when his father died of stomach cancer. The Bonaparte family was left in financial ruin, and at just 15, Napoleon was forced to take on the responsibility of managing his family's strained affairs from his barracks. He spent his time at the academy largely alone, retreating into the study of mathematics, geography, and artillery strategy. He used academic achievement as a way to navigate an environment that was consistently hostile to his presence. Despite the social isolation, his performance was exceptional. He completed the rigorous 2-year course at the École Militaire in Paris in just 1 year, becoming a second lieutenant in an elite artillery regiment. These years in the academy did not make Napoleon feel French. They made him a strategist. He left his education with a deep understanding of the military apparatus he served, and a reliance on his own intellect above all else. The outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 dissolved the traditional military hierarchies of the monarchy. For many officers, the collapse of the old order was a disaster, but for a lieutenant with merit, it was an opening. The new republic began to value tactical talent over noble birth. This shift allowed officers from modest backgrounds to advance through the ranks with a speed that was previously impossible. Yet Napoleon's first instinct during the chaos was not to seek promotion in Paris. Instead, he took an extended leave of absence and returned to Corsica, hoping to participate in the revolution on his own terms. He attempted to align himself with the returning Corsican independence leader, Pasquale Paoli. Napoleon saw an opportunity to finally serve the cause his father had abandoned decades earlier. Even after years of training in French academies, his priority was still the island. He wanted to use his skills to secure a place in a Corsican government that was now moving towards secession from France. Paoli rejected the alliance. He viewed the entire Bonaparte family with suspicion, seeing them as French sympathizers who had profited from Carlo's earlier submission to the crown. The political disagreement turned into direct conflict between rival clans. Paoli supporters eventually targeted the Bonapartes, sacking and burning their family home in Ajaccio. In June 1793, the Corsican Assembly officially declared Napoleon and his family traitors. They were condemned to perpetual infamy and effectively banished from their homeland. With a death sentence hanging over them, the family fled the island by boat at night, arriving on the French mainland as impoverished refugees. This total rejection by Corsica severed Napoleon's ties to his birthland. With his family home in ruins and his name cursed on the island, he now had no choice but to commit his ambition and his survival entirely to the destiny of the French Republic. Napoleon transitioned his focus immediately. The energy he had spent on Corsican politics was now directed at the survival of the French government, which was facing threats from every side. His first significant breakthrough occurred at the Siege of Toulon in 1793. Royalist rebels had invited the British fleet into the port, giving France's greatest enemy a foothold on French soil. This map shows the difficulty of the harbor. The British fleet was positioned securely within the bay, out of reach of conventional infantry assault. Napoleon identified the geometric key to the siege. He realized that by capturing the heights of Fort Mulgrave, French artillery could dominate the anchorage. He placed his guns with precision, forcing the British ships to evacuate the harbor to avoid destruction. 2 years later, he was called to defend the government again. In Paris, a royalist uprising threatened to storm the French Directory and end the Republic. Napoleon ordered his artillery to fire canister rounds directly into the insurgent columns at close range. This whiff of grape shot killed hundreds and instantly dispersed the rebellion. This calculated use of force in the streets of Paris convinced the French leadership that Napoleon was their most reliable commander, capable of solving political crises through mathematical military precision. His role in saving the Directory led to a promotion to commander of the Army of the Interior, and provided him with the high-level political patronage he needed to advance. He quickly married Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow from the colonial elite, who provided him with a crucial social connection to the leaders of the Republic. At this time, he also changed the spelling of his name. He dropped the Italian U from Buonaparte, officially adopting the French Bonaparte in his signatures. Just 2 days after his wedding, he left Paris to take command of the Army of Italy, beginning a campaign that would test his theories of maneuver and massed artillery on a continental scale. Napoleon had moved from an isolated cadet and a failed Corsican rebel to a French general with an army at his back. He was now a high-ranking officer of the Republic, poised to cross the Alps and begin his first independent campaign. By 1796, the French Republic was besieged by hostile European monarchies. Internally, the government was mired in bankruptcy and corruption under the Directory, an executive council that had lost the confidence of the French people. The Republic needed a military force to ensure its survival. The Directory began searching for a sword, a general capable of protecting the state from total collapse. They appointed a young, relatively unknown Napoleon Bonaparte to lead the Army of Italy. He arrived to find a starving, mutinous force that lacked even basic supplies. Napoleon ignored traditional, slower methods of warfare. With rapid maneuvers, he split the Sardinian and Austrian armies, defeating them in detail. In a single year, winning 18 battles, he seized northern Italy and marched within 100 miles of Vienna, forcing the Austrians to negotiate peace. The campaign sent millions in looted wealth back to Paris, stabilizing the nation's finances and making Napoleon a national hero. Napoleon used these victories to build a personal power base. By founding his own newspapers and communicating directly with the public, he created a military authority that the weak government could no longer restrain. In 1798, Napoleon launched an expedition to Egypt. He intended to strike at British trade routes to India, while establishing a permanent French presence in the Middle East. He brought a team of 167 scholars and scientists, whose discoveries, including the Rosetta Stone, provided the French public with tangible proof of the expedition's cultural significance. These scientific triumphs soon clashed with a brutal military reality. While the French army was busy on land, British Admiral Horatio Nelson located the French fleet. At the Battle of the Nile, the British destroyed or captured nearly every French vessel. With his fleet gone, Napoleon and his entire army were stranded in Egypt. The campaign turned into a struggle for survival. Thousands of French soldiers died of bubonic plague, and during a desperate siege in Syria, Napoleon ordered the execution of thousands of prisoners at Jaffa because he could not afford to feed them. Hearing of political turmoil back in Paris, Napoleon made a ruthless calculation. He secretly boarded a ship and sailed for France, leaving his dying army behind under the command of his subordinates. His propaganda had already reached the capital, masking the desertion. When he arrived in Paris in October 1799, the public hailed him as a victorious conqueror, largely unaware of the disaster he had left in the desert. By late 1799, the Directory was collapsing under the weight of inflation and military reverses. Napoleon began conspiring with politician Emmanuel Sieyès to overthrow the government and install a new regime. On the morning of 18 Brumaire, the plotters fabricated a rumor of an imminent Jacobin rebellion. This allowed them to move the legislature to the safety of the suburbs, while placing Napoleon in command of all local troops. The coup nearly failed the following day, when the deputies realized they were being intimidated. As Napoleon attempted to address the Council of 500, he was heckled, shoved, and physically assaulted by the resisting legislators. Napoleon's brother Lucien saved the conspiracy. As president of the council, Lucien called in the military to clear the chamber, and grenadiers with fixed bayonets forcefully drove the deputies out of the building. Sieyès had planned to use Napoleon as a military figurehead, but Napoleon outmaneuvered his co-conspirators. He secured the primary leadership role in the new government, known as the consulate. The newly drafted constitution of the year 8 concentrated all actual executive power solely in Napoleon's hands as first consul. The legislative bodies were reduced to advisory roles, with no real power to check his decisions. The coup successfully dismantled the republic from within. France was now a dictatorship, though it maintained a democratic appearance to pacify the public. After securing political control, Napoleon turned to the internal structure of the French state. He implemented a series of reforms designed to centralize power and modernize the nation's administration. He established the Bank of France, created a national education system, and signed the Concordat of 1801, which restored the Catholic Church's status while keeping it under government supervision. His most significant legacy was the 1804 Napoleonic Code, replacing chaotic regional laws with a single legal system. It abolished feudalism, guaranteeing men equality and merit-based advancement. Yet, it stripped women of civil rights, emphasizing a rigid family hierarchy that mirrored Napoleon's authoritarian rule. The Napoleonic Code proved that Napoleon could conquer French society with administrative law just as effectively as he had conquered his enemies with artillery. By 1804, Napoleon used a royalist assassination plot as a pretext to eliminate his remaining political rivals. Through a series of arrests and executions, he terrified any remaining opposition to his absolute rule. That December, at Notre Dame, he took the crown from the Pope and placed it on his own head. He was now Emperor of the French. It was a final irony. The man who had risen to power as the sword of the Republic had successfully used that same power to bury it.
Sire, je vous donne. Vivete couronne.
In late 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte's Grande Armée sat hundreds of miles from home, deep in enemy territory. Facing a combined Russo-Austrian force that heavily outnumbered them, the French positions near the Moravian town of Austerlitz were dangerously overextended. This topographical map of the Austerlitz battlefield illustrates how Napoleon turned that vulnerability into a weapon. He deliberately ordered a retreat from the dominant Pratzen Heights. By thinning his right flank, he offered the Allies an irresistible target, luring their massive formations down to attack. As the Allied forces committed to crushing that weak right flank, Marshal Davout arrived with the French Third Corps. After a grueling forced march from Vienna, completed in just 50 hours, his men plugged the gap and absorbed the massive assault. Pushing so much weight against the French right left the Allied center dangerously thin. Waiting in the valley below, Marshal Soult's IV Corps charged up the heights through the clearing mist. They shattered the weakened center and drove a wedge straight through the Austro-Russian army. The rout was absolute. The military defeat forced Austria to the negotiating table, ended the War of the Third Coalition, and resulted in the formal dissolution of the centuries-old Holy Roman Empire. Austerlitz remains one of the most lopsided victories in military history. By achieving a total victory against a numerically superior foe in a single afternoon, Napoleon proved his tactical system worked perfectly, establishing a standard for success that would make any future compromise or retreat feel unnecessary. That momentum carried directly into the following year, during the War of the Fourth Coalition. Facing Prussia, Napoleon deployed his modernized corps system against an army still relying on tactics developed decades earlier. The result was a rapid dismantling of the Prussian state. On October 14, 1806, the two armies clashed in the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. While Napoleon won at Jena, Marshal Davout at Auerstedt truly broke the Prussian military. Isolated with a single corps of 27,000 men, Davout faced down and routed the main Prussian army of 64,000. Within weeks, French troops marched into Berlin. Surveying his conquest, Napoleon visited the tomb of Frederick the Great. Examining the resting place of Europe's previous military icon, he reportedly instructed his marshals to remove their hats in respect. With Prussia subdued and Austria broken, Napoleon redrew the map of Central Europe. He organized the conquered German states into the Confederation of the Rhine, forging a vast, compliant buffer zone between France and the surviving Eastern powers. He then leveraged this control over the mainland to strike at Britain, implementing the continental system. By barring British ships from European ports, he intended to strangle his final major rival through a continent-wide economic embargo. By dismantling two of Europe's most established empires in less than 2 years, Napoleon had transformed the geopolitical landscape. His command was no longer merely a matter of French foreign policy, but a personal project to shape the continent to his own design. That ambition soon targeted an ally. Frustrated by gaps in his embargo, Napoleon moved French troops through Spain to invade Portugal. Once embedded, he seized the opportunity to depose the Spanish royal family entirely and placed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne in Madrid. The Spanish populace rejected the move immediately. On May 2, 1808, the citizens of Madrid exploded into a violent rebellion against the occupying troops, igniting a nationalist uprising that rapidly consumed the entire Iberian Peninsula. This resistance took the form of guerrilla warfare. Instead of symmetric infantry lines matching maneuver for maneuver, Spanish peasants, farmers, and priests waged a decentralized campaign of lethal ambushes against French patrols. The chaos spread to the regular forces. In July of 1808, at the Battle of Baylen, an overextended French army of 24,000 men was tracked and forced to surrender by a reconstituted Spanish force. The surrender at Baylen was the first open-field defeat for a Napoleonic army. It proved to nations from London to Moscow that the French military machine could be broken. The professional legions that had conquered Prussia and Austria were unequipped for this new reality. They could win battles against other kings, but they had no answer for an armed, motivated populace fighting for their own soil. As the occupation dragged on, the conflict devolved into a cycle of brutality. Spanish insurgents subjected captured French soldiers to severe torture, and French forces responded with mass executions and the burning of entire villages. By constantly isolating remote garrisons and intercepting supply convoys, the partisans effectively neutralized French tactical superiority. Even basic dispatches required hundreds of cavalry escorts just to guarantee safe passage between towns. This chart shows the occupation's toll. Over 4 years, it devoured 800 million francs and 250,000 troops. At its peak, the empire deployed 350,000 troops to Iberia. Yet over 200,000 were tied down guarding supply lines, leaving only a fraction for combat. This logistical paralysis provided the perfect opening for Great Britain. A British expeditionary force under Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal, leveraging the guerrilla chaos to wage a campaign of attrition against the distracted French. Napoleon called it his Spanish ulcer. The insurgency transformed the French Empire into a desperately overextended entity, fighting a war it could neither win nor afford to abandon. Watching the French army bleed in Spain, rival powers recognized their opening. In 1809, the Austrian Empire rearmed and mobilized, launching the War of the Fifth Coalition to break French dominance in Central Europe. Napoleon rushed to confront them. Attempting a rapid crossing of the flooding Danube River with a single pontoon bridge, his vanguard was isolated. At the Battle of Aspern-Essling, the Austrians inflicted Napoleon's first major tactical defeat in person, forcing a bloody French withdrawal. Stung by the loss, he spent the next 6 weeks meticulously stockpiling supplies, reinforcing his ranks, and constructing heavily fortified, redundant bridges to secure a second crossing. The ensuing Battle of Wagram was an exhaustive 2-day frontal slugging match. The French eventually forced an Austrian retreat, but the victory required pouring massive infantry columns directly into enemy fire, resulting in nearly 40,000 French casualties. Wagram was a far cry from the low-casualty maneuvers of Austerlitz or Jena. It was an exercise in sheer attrition, won by absorbing massive losses until the opponent finally broke. Wagram showed that Napoleon's enemies had finally adapted to his operational doctrines. They were no longer easily broken by a single maneuver. Instead, they were prepared to endure staggering casualties, forcing the French into a new, more lethal style of combat. Amidst mounting casualties, Napoleon faced an internal crisis. His empire relied entirely on his personal command. Without a legitimate bloodline to inherit the throne, the political structure would likely fracture the moment he died. His wife, Josephine, was unable to bear an heir. In 1810, driven by the cold arithmetic of state survival, Napoleon signed the paperwork to divorce the woman he genuinely loved. He immediately brokered a marriage to an 18-year-old Austrian Archduchess, Marie-Louise. It was a purely transactional alliance, engineered to secure a dynastic heir and tie his upstart regime to one of Europe's oldest royal families. A year later, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son, immediately titled the King of Rome. Napoleon had his bloodline, securing the imperial succession at the cost of his personal happiness. Yet, while he celebrated dynastic security in the halls of Paris, the foundations of his empire were burning. French soldiers were still being slaughtered by the thousands in the unending insurgency across Spain. The unparalleled military success that forged the French Empire had simultaneously fostered an ambition that refused to recognize limits. The victories of the past had created an architecture of power that was now too heavy for its own foundations to support. This chart shows the sheer scale of the French military in June 1812. Napoleon Bonaparte has massed 615,000 men at the Russian border, a force larger than any previous European army. His dominance over the continent is total, and he launches this invasion to force Tsar Alexander into compliance with his continental system. As he crossed the Niemen River, a hare darted between his horse's legs, throwing the emperor to the ground. Observers whispered it was a bad omen. It was an early warning that the environment itself would not yield to his command. Napoleon's military doctrine relied entirely on swift, decisive engagements to force a surrender. But Russian generals Barclay de Tolly and Kutuzov refused to oblige him. Instead, they pulled their forces deeper into the interior, burning crops, supply depots, and bridges in a relentless scorched earth retreat. The French army was forced to march through an empty, blackened wasteland. Before they even fought a major battle, extreme summer heat, typhus, and dysentery claimed 100,000 soldiers. The defining tactics that had conquered Europe failed here. The vastness of the Russian interior destroyed the army's ability to sustain itself long before the first major engagement. By September, the French finally captured Moscow, only to find it deserted and engulfed in flames. Napoleon lingered in the charred ruins for a month, waiting for a surrender from the Tsar that never came. The delay forced a retreat through the onset of the Russian winter. Men and horses froze to death on the march. The horror peaked at the Berezina River, where thousands were trampled, drowned, or abandoned to escape the closing Russian jaws. Of the 615,000 men who marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 staggered out. Realizing the magnitude of the disaster, Napoleon left his decimated forces behind, fleeing back to Paris in a horse-drawn sled. The loss shattered the illusion of French invincibility. Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain formed the Sixth Coalition, invading France from multiple fronts. By April 1814, they had captured Paris and forced Napoleon to sign his unconditional abdication at the Palace of Fontainebleau. The Allied powers banished him from the continent. He was sent to the Mediterranean island of Elba, a tiny coastal territory that served as his new kingdom. The scale of the Russian interior had broken the Grande Armée. Napoleon's reputation for invincibility died in the snow, marking his first major loss of geopolitical territory. But confinement did not suit him. In March 1815, after less than a year in exile, Napoleon slipped past British guard ships and landed in southern France with barely 1,000 men, initiating the period known as the 100 Days. As he marched north, King Louis XVIII dispatched the Royalist 7th Infantry to arrest him. At Loffrey, the two forces met. Napoleon stepped out alone, ripped open his coat, and dared the soldiers to shoot their emperor. No one fired. Instead, the troops wept and defected to his side. The march to Paris became a bloodless, triumphant procession, as Royalist forces repeatedly laid down their arms to join him. The reaction from the rest of Europe was instantaneous. Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria declared him an outlaw and assembled the Seventh Coalition, mobilizing massive armies to ensure his final defeat. He had reclaimed the loyalty of the French people, but he was now geopolitically trapped. The borders of Europe were closing in around him. This trap snapped shut on June 18, 1815. Unlike the vast Russian interior, the battlefield at Waterloo was a narrow, shallow valley in present-day Belgium. Heavy rains had turned the terrain into thick mud. Napoleon himself was physically constrained. Suffering from painful hemorrhoids and urinary retention, he could not stay in the saddle. Unable to actively survey the field, he was forced to delegate direct command. Hoping to improve the effectiveness of his artillery, he delayed the initial assault until late morning, waiting for the muddy ground to dry. Those lost hours cost him the battle. This tactical map shows the deadlock that followed. Marshal Ney ordered massive, unsupported cavalry charges against the Duke of Wellington's lines. The defenders formed tight British infantry squares, a defensive geometry that repelled the horsemen and exhausted the French ranks. Because of the morning delay, time ran out. General von Blücher's Prussian forces arrived precisely as Wellington's line was nearing its breaking point, driving hard into the exposed French right flank. In a last desperate bid, Napoleon committed his undefeated Imperial Guard, but they too were repulsed. The French army collapsed into a chaotic rout. Weeks later, Napoleon formally surrendered to the captain of the British warship HMS Bellerophon. His strategic genius was crushed, hemmed in by a muddy valley, failing physical health, and a fatal miscalculation of time. To ensure he could never return, the British exiled him to St. Helena. It was a remote volcanic rock situated in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from any continent. His residence, Longwood House, was a damp, rat-infested former farm on a windswept plateau. It was a severe micro-prison, a contrast to the grand European palaces he had once occupied. The island's governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, engaged in strict psychological containment. He restricted Napoleon's movements, intercepted his mail, and refused to address him as emperor, insisting on General Bonaparte to downplay his historical status. The isolation took a heavy toll, but it was his failing body that ultimately betrayed him. Napoleon spent his final months confined to a small bed, suffering from the excruciating pain of advanced stomach cancer. His physician, Dr. François Antomarchi, misdiagnosed the condition as a mere diplomatic illness. He administered a massive toxic dose of calomel, a mercury-based laxative that only aggravated the ulcer in his stomach. On May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, Napoleon died. Those present recorded his final whispered words: "France, the army, head of the army, Josephine." The man who had commanded the expanse of a continent was ultimately defeated by a petty island bureaucracy and the cellular collapse of his own body. Yet physical containment could not hold his legacy. In 1840, 19 years after his death, the French government orchestrated the Retour des Cendres, the return of his ashes to France. 1 million citizens lined the streets of Paris to watch his coffin pass. He was brought to the military complex of Les Invalides, received with full state honors by the nation. There, his remains were placed in a massive, reddish-brown quartzite sarcophagus. It was positioned in the center of an open circular crypt, surrounded by marble angels and inscriptions of his greatest victories. The prisoner, who died in agony on a damp mattress in the South Atlantic, was elevated into a monumental architectural triumph in the center of the French capital. Europe's geography and coalitions successfully destroyed Napoleon the Man, but the isolation of his final years transformed his legacy into a myth that would outlive the empires that caged him.
Sire, je vous donne. Vivete corona.